Therapists of Reddit, what was your biggest, I know I'm not supposed to judge you, but holy shit moment? Part 2. Story 1. Not a licensed therapist, but a behavioral health technician. Basically, means I got a psych degree. I was trained in behavioral intervention techniques for children and was off helping coach parents to support children with behavior disorders. I'll say this. I rarely encountered a child that had a clear mental illness in the same way as when I worked with adults with serious mental illness. In many ways, they were visibly confused or lonely. Given that most of their parents were suffering from poverty, alleviating the burdens of being poor would have likely mitigated the most severe symptoms of many of the children. Advocating for affordable childcare and livable minimum wages is mental health advocacy. I found myself judging, not the children, but their parents. Some parents would drop the kids off with me and peace out with a fix my kid attitude. As a parent now, I get some of it. Exhaustion and burnout are real. But the best I could do in that situation was provide that kid with an hour-long vision of what it looks like to live in a loving, structured environment. Those kids were the ones I could tell who were much more likely to be subject to the system for the duration of their lives. Either cycles of institutionalization and homelessness or prison. When a concerned parent showed up and asked, "How do I help my kid?" I practically jumped for joy for the child because they had someone who loved them and was fighting for them. Story 2. Not a therapist, a doctor. Had a patient apologize for crying during a consultation saying, "I know I shouldn't be sad. I've got so many great things going for me." Dude, 3 months ago you had to move back to your parents after an unexpected breakup. Back to the environment which contributed to your official diagnosis. The same place where your sister was living, before she died, 1 month after your return to that house, of the same diagnosis you have. And because she died during a pandemic, not only could you not visit her in hospital before she died, you had difficulty organizing her funeral. In addition to all that, he felt financially responsible for both his parents as they'd both lost their benefits. A loss which they couldn't appeal as their mental health was so poor, the concept of fighting that decision was making them suicidal. I want to hug a lot of my patients, but this one made my heart ache. Story 3. I'm not a therapist, but was a patient after my mom passed away and needed someone to help me sort out everything I was experiencing in the wake of her death. We were discussing some major trauma. I was abandoned by both parents, as well as severe neglect/abuse at the hands of caregivers. At one point, I looked up and saw my therapist had put down her notepad clipboard and was staring at me, wide-eyed. I thought she was going to diagnose me or tell me I was crazy. There was this awkward silence and she said, "You need to realize how special you are. You did it. You could have been a statistic, but you beat the odds. Do you mind if we dig back into your childhood? I want to see what you were thinking when all this was going on, because it might help me with other patients." So that was a remarkable moment for me. She told me that not only was I normal, she found me to be exceptional. We worked together, CBT, for 8 months on my triggers and attachment issues, and put me on a path to healing. I love her. She's just an awesome person who found value in my damaged past, and in a way, allowed me to help others. Story 4. The wife and I went through marriage counseling there for a bit. I told the counseling the wife always had a tone. The wife replies, "I don't have a fucking tone." The counseling looked at the wife and said, You kinda do lol." Wife laughed it off and said, "Okay, maybe a little bit." But a week later when the counselor and I had our one-on-one session, she stated she wasn't supposed to judge, but in that moment she could see way. I said in a previous session the wife can sometimes come off as a royal. Story 5 is seeing a therapist actually worth it? My doctor has been telling me to seek one out for literally years, but I don't see how talking is going to solve anything. Anyone that's been to therapy have any insight? Story 6. I'm not a therapist, but similar scenario. I hung out with a friend back in June after not seeing her for about 8 months. She was arrested a few days prior for destroying her boyfriend's stuff. She was in an extremely toxic and abusive relationship on both ends. Anyways, I'm hanging out with her and she's quite different. She's so paranoid and constantly taking pictures of people. She'd take a selfie and capture someone behind her and tried to be sneaky, but it was obvious. Finally, I just asked her what is going on, and after her hesitating saying I wouldn't believe her, I assured her I would. Well, she starts by saying how her boyfriend is the leader to an underground secret society, like the Illuminati or some. And he apparently is manufacturing some unknown drug that doesn't show up on any drug tests and is using it to rape her and sell her body to random people. She said this is why she was taking pictures of everyone because she's convinced they know her and know her boyfriend and that they'll tell him they saw her with me. I was pretty freaked out and I honestly believe she had to be suffering some psychotic break or possibly schizophrenia. The worst part of the story and what really made me say, holy shit, was her mom. So it turns out later that night she went to the ER because she was suicidal. I picked up her mum since she took the only car, and we drove to the hospital but couldn't go in, of course, because COVID. We were able to call and verify she was there and spoke with the nurse who was going to do her psych eval. She couldn't tell us anything, but she did ask if we had any concerns or if she had a history of mental illness. Her mum said yes, just suicidal. She knows something else was going on with her daughter and she refused to believe it. I was honest with the nurse and told her what I wrote above. Her mum absolutely flipped the out on me and get this, accused me of ruining their vacation. Apparently they had airplane tickets for Florida in 3 days, and they ended up committing her to psych hospital. I couldn't believe the mum cared more about her holiday and money than the health and well-being of her daughter. We haven't talked since this, but I hope she's doing better. I don't regret it. She can hate me all she wants, but she was definitely in need of help. Story 7. Obligatory, not a therapist, and this will probably get buried. But as a no man, I really struggled with going to therapy. But it was the absolute low point in my life, and I have always dealt with depression, but I can from the just get through it mentality. Well, I was closer and closer to not getting through it. I remember the first time I told my therapist that I was planning on killing myself. I expected the same reaction that men showing their emotions and vulnerabilities get. But she never did. Never even acted like it wasn't an option. She just talked me through it, never acting like my thoughts or feelings were invalid. Sorry, not exactly the point of the question, but if fear of being judged or anything is holding you back from going, please go. It could save your life. Story 8. Therapist here. I don't think I've ever judged clients. My job is to understand them and their experiences and help them make the improvements they are ready to make. But I have very directly made my thoughts clear about choices, especially choices parents make for sour about their kids. This probably comes off as judgment depending on the client's insecurity about the topic. One example was telling parents of a child I was working with a severe mood disorder that had made both suicidal and homicidal threats and attempts, that it did not seem like a good idea to buy the young kid a gun, especially the week after the mother spent the session sharing her fears that the child would murder her. Story 9. Actual licensed therapist here. I agree with what someone else said. I really never judge my clients. You're trained to kind of switch your brain off from that kind of thinking. I think people get into this field, at least the people that should, most therapists I've met I wouldn't send a loved one to, do so because they are very open-minded to begin with. That being said, if some of my family friends had made the choices that clients have told me about, I would totally judge them because I'm in a subjective role. As a therapist, your role is to remain as objective. This is the whole reason people go to a therapist. This doesn't mean I haven't had a lot of moments where I think, holy shit, this is wild. But that's different than judgment. It's such a weird, awesome job. There's also a difference between judging and expressing your concern. It needs to be very delicately worded as to not make someone feel like they're being judged, because then you've lost their trust and willingness to be vulnerable with you. If you're finding yourself having trouble not judging a client and can't work your own reasons out, that's when you refer them out to someone who can be more beneficial to them. Story 10. Licensed psychologist here. As many have said, judgments really aren't part of the gig if you've had good training and spent time doing the internal work on yourself as part of the process. That being said, I don't think all therapists have done that, so don't be afraid to stop seeing one of you. Don't think it's a good fit. I often tell clients that I see my role as being a navigator, while they are the captain. I know I've been hired on to help plot a course from where they are to their goals. While I know a lot about the waters and landscape, psychology, human behavior, habits, ECT, I count on them to be the expert on the boat and crew, themselves, their lives, important relationships. I don't expect them to take every recommendation or tool because they may know things that I don't, and I respect that. My job is to just help adjust the course as needed to avoid obstacles or deal with them when they come up. It's not my job to tell them how to live, what to do, or to judge them when they make decisions, even if those decisions are different than something we talked about. It's their boat. I almost always add, though, if I end up suggesting 20 tools cost courses and you take none, but then come in complaining about us sailing in circles, that becomes a different conversation. Still their choice, but I'll call out concerns when I see them, with as much respect as someone does when talking to the captain. Even that conversation is without judgment, though. It's just about naming a process that you see occurring and seeking to understand what's getting in the way. Story 11 Therapist here. Honestly, I have never had a moment where I've internally criticized someone for their past, not even the current decisions they are making. Therapy doesn't work that way, and I can't do my job properly if I'm being full of myself and intentionally project. That said, I do sometimes have reactions to people's stories, and I suppose there is an argument for that's judging. However, I disagree. The way OP phrased their question, I'm inclined to think they meant straight up, geez, what's wrong with you kind of judgment. But I can't ignore my reactions to people. The whole, check your emotions at the door, just doesn't fly in therapy. If you ever meet a therapist that tells you they can be completely objective, run. That's just not how people work. For example, am I supposed to suppress my pity when a girl comes into my office and tells me she isn't sad when she tells me her mom died? What about when parents of a handicapped child are relieved when their kid dies? Am I judging them in the critical way? Hell no. Do I reactively feel pity sad? Hell yes. What about when I feel frustrated because a guy I work with is so close to understanding that his partner's anxiety has little to do with him? Am I going to get pissed at the guy? No. But part of responsible and competent therapy is that I acknowledge that part of me that instinctively reacts to others' stories. If I just push it down, it will come up in other ways, and then it could damage the work I do. As a therapist, I need to be mindful of how I'm reacting to what I'm working with. If necessary, I can consult with colleagues, in an ethical, confidential, de-identifying way, of course. Then, once I process any feelings I may have, I can go back to do what I do. I love the process of change. And being honest with myself is definitely a challenge. But I would hate to find myself critical of someone who is doing the best with what they have. Story 12. Guy assaulted his wife and then told me he didn't, and she was lying. However, he later told me that they were having relationship problems because he didn't feel that she should be able to refuse him since they were married. I found out after the fact the wife had also reported to police he had sexually assaulted her as well. This was 5+ years ago in the South, so sadly not uncommon, but it was his lack of remorse or any acknowledgement of wrongdoing and breezy way of bringing this up that was really upsetting. Story 13. This one patient pronounced GIF as GIF. Fucking maniac SMH, like bro FR, like seriously, edit. These dudes replying to me are fucking worse than the patient. Story 14. Therapist in training here. I haven't even started working with clients yet, but I love the way therapists are responding to this question with legit empathy and care for their clients. That's how I hope to be when I start working with people. Story 15. Commenting from the opposite viewpoint of this. I have quite severe OCD. With the counselor before my current one, I was just starting to open up about some really embarrassing obsessions. I told him about it, and he laughed. While I was being vulnerable and nearly in tears. He did try to cover it with a cough, but failed. After that, it took over 2 years before I reached out to another therapist. I feel like if you're judging a client, you shouldn't be a therapist, because you'll cause more harm than good. Story 16. Can we just take a moment to give major kudos to all the therapists out there? You take on many burdens that aren't your own, and you seek to be a non-judgmental listening ear with a gift to guide your patients into their own resolutions. You have saved lives and should be honored as much as firefighters, the military, etc. Story 17. Not a therapist, but this just happened to me, so I thought I'd plug. I'm a registered nurse working in a critical care setting. Part of the job is to be understanding and respectful of a variety of beliefs and cultures. Recently, I had a family member request to speak to me privately to explain his concerns about the care of his spouse. Conversation starts off okay with some legitimate concerns, then he starts complaining about having to wear a mask in the room. This sparks him going off on the most crazy conspiracy theory I have ever heard from an actual person. Consisted of, COVID-19 is a simulation by the WHO to test our willingness to comply. Viruses are created by our own body and not from anywhere else. He said, this explains the flu. Masks can kill you by causing you to breathe in your own carbon monoxide. Had to stop myself from smiling here. 5G towers are what's really causing people to have lung problems. I'm not paid enough to deal with that. Story 18. I started up with a new therapist many years ago. I was in a really black hole, living on my own in a shitty little one-bedroom apartment, drinking too much, missing my kids like crazy. They are grown and live in a different state. The lady had a lovely office and comfy chairs, and I must have just felt so comfortable for the first time in a long time, I began pouring my heart out. After about 10 minutes, I looked up and this lovely lady therapist was crying. I didn't know what to do. She said she was missing her kids also, and I guess I sparked something. We talked for a few minutes and I left no charge. I hope she's doing better now. Story 19. It's never the things people suspect they're being judged for. A good therapist never judges you based on how much of a substance you use, how harmful your coping skills are, the things you've said and done that you're ashamed of. We exist to hear and recognize and help you with these things. You're worth it. Having someone see your value despite XYZ. It's the parents that don't give a odd about their kids. I judge them hard. And I don't mean parents who are trying, who are working to undo generational trauma and doing their best even if they're making things harder for their kid and all that trying. I'm talking about those parents, like people have mentioned here, that 100% do not give a about their child and actively make their child's life worse. As a child therapist, this is my snapping point, and the judgment comes rolling right out. Kids deserve better. Story 20. Licensed art therapist here. I think an important thing to note is that therapists are really taught how to approach therapy without judgment. We do have two important terms to be aware of, which are transference and countertransference. Transference, noun. The redirection of feelings about a specific person onto someone else. In therapy, this refers to a client's projection of their feelings about someone else onto their therapist. Countertransference, noun. The redirection of a therapist's feelings toward the client. That being said, I've definitely felt strong and visceral countertransference towards clients before. I've had clients with very different political beliefs. I've had clients who believe the pandemic is a hoax. And I've had clients who have been abusers in their past. If I were having conversations with someone in passing, not as a therapist, about the hoax theory, would I pass judgment? Yes, probably. But it's different when it's in the therapy space. But the most important thing to keep in mind as a therapist is that this person in front of you is human, and they are sitting with you in hopes of digging and working through their internal scaries. They are opening up, showing vulnerability, and letting you see into their mind and history. Story 21. I've spent my fair share of time in the ward, but I'm no therapist. There's an understanding that we're all a little fucked up in there, so we really try not to judge each other. Most of us, anyways. But every once in a while, you get those people who are just a different level of crazy. Now, I was on the ward for a suicide attempt. And it wasn't exactly a secret. You can usually pick out within the first few minutes who's there for finding the end of their rope, and who's there because it's better in jail. But then there are the ones who are there because there is no safer place for them to be. And you're usually lucky to see them because they spend most of their time isolated and doped. Well, I was lucky enough to meet one of them right before he got doped and isolated. He was such a nice guy that I assumed he was an attempter, like me. You tend to find a lot of the best qualities in people after they've tried to end their life. With this gentleman, that was very much the case. I saw the best in him. Can I take your plate for you? We have to tell him no, you're not supposed to be anything except self-sufficient on the ward. Can I do your laundry for you? Can I wash these dishes before we send them back to the cafeteria? A lot of this was going on, and after 3 days of it, it was definitely becoming apparent that his typical concoction of meds had fully worn off, and he was getting snippy about it. Well, my first experience with extreme bipolar disorder went a little like this. May I sit next to you? I'm a little tense and would love a conversation to get my mind off of it. Sure thing, B. I'm gonna finish this pudding and put a show on. What would you like to watch? Oh, nothing. Hey, have you ever tried to hurt yourself? Yeah, I have. It's why I'm in here. Why didn't it work? Well, I stopped myself and drove here after I caught a glimpse of what it would do to my dad if he found me. I see. Well, they won't let me have anything in my room, but watch this. He hands me the end of a long strand of toilet paper. You hold that end and just watch. Now, as I'm holding it, I already have this idea in my head that this guy is actively trying to hurt himself. So I'm a bit curious to see what he's doing, but I'm also a bit paranoid that he may have given up on hurting himself and is now targeting someone else. But as I sit there watching him twist this toilet paper and fold it in on itself, I recognize what he's created as the start of a noose, and it dawns on me. He's trying to teach me how to hang myself. I still think about that guy. I wonder what he's like day to day when he's regular. All I ever saw was this overly exuberant, bubbly personality which was tailored to make people think he wasn't as crazy as he really was. He hurt a couple of nurses that night, and the day after his noose creation, he was isolated to his room for the remainder of my stay. Story 22. This will never get read, so I can say this. I gave my therapist a moment my last session. We were speaking about my younger years, and I told her something, and she sat straight up and said, "Holy shit." It was a holy moment, but it led to a breakthrough. She's of a great therapist. Story 23. I currently have a young female client that is struggling with homelessness, a history of trauma, sexual abuse, etc. She's not handling these things well, as can be expected. Grandmother, who is her only support, keeps kicking the 10-year-old out of her house, making her homeless at 10, for acting out, and told me she can't understand why client won't just act right. Lady, are you serious? Story 24. There was a client, a young teenager that was hearing voices to hurt himself. He had multiple crisis calls and was admitted several times to crisis centers for observation until he got prescribed meds and was starting to show improvement. He was starting to disclose that he may have been gay and was stressed out because his father was old-school religious and a pillar of the community. The young man was recommended to go to treatment start in a facility to keep him acclimate to meds, and just to give him some coping skills and all that. His father pulled him out AMA and refused to allow him to continue medication. He also discontinued his therapy for a more religious approach. 3 months later, he completed his suicide. I see that father around and I want to him up. I wish I could. Story 25. Teen client is raped at a birthday party where the adults were giving alcohol to the minors. She calls her mother to come get her and reports the rape to her. Mother's response. Stupid teenagers will do what stupid teenagers do. You'll get over it. 24 hours later, client calls me in hysterics after a suicide attempt and tells me what happened and what her mom said. I stay on one phone with client while trying to call her mother from another. Mom refuses to answer my calls and send a message saying she can't leave work, but the grandfather is coming home from FL to take care of her daughter. Yako, I go pick up client and take her to the ER where we spend a traumatizing 96 hours. The highlight of which being when the coroner refused to complete the rape kit and said in front of my client that she just had next morning regrets, and he wasn't ruining some young man's life for that. I judged hard and I judged openly. I also nearly went to jail for ripping the coroner anew in the middle of the ER. Story 26. Sorry, but this post is not a good idea. I'm in medical profession, and we have a no-disclosure rule. We can't share anything about a patient without their permission. In case of therapists, it is even more important to keep it a secret. Plus, some people who may have actual problems similar to the examples given here will have a harder time seeking help. Story 27. Couples counseling. Parents of a baby, 4 or 5 months old. We are halfway in our session when I ask them about their baby. Mom. She is in bed right now. Me. Ah, grandparents babysitting? Dad. No, she is at home alone. Nothing can happen to her. We bought a special mattress, one where she, baby, cannot suffocate me, mouth open, staring at them for a couple of seconds. Then, how long did it take you to get here? Mom. 15 minutes or so. Me. All right, the session is over. I want you guys to go home immediately and call me when you arrive. Please hurry. And never ever leave your baby alone. Story 28. I'm a psychotherapist on an adult inpatient unit, so things rarely faze me. I purposely do inpatient because the thought of seeing people for years at a time bores me. I've been kicked, spit on, seen a lot of people, but I help pull people back from their darkest points. It's pretty awesome. My theory is everyone has a story of how they got there, even a pedophile. That being said, I had a patient that was having consensual with her uncle. Very wealthy, society-type people. She went very in-depth about the relationship. That one weirded me out. Story 29. Gentleman sat down for the initial consultation and said, "I'll get right to the point, doc. I've been married 5 times. My question is, what does it take to find a decent woman?" No humor, no hint of irony. None. Story 30. I first went into college wanting to become a social worker. I'm so blessed that I had an amazing professor for my first round of classes. He was a social worker for like 35 years, and he was the head of the sex offenders probation unit in a huge county in my area. He even was the head of the team when Amber went missing and worked with her mother. Think Amber Alert. He was so honest with us students, and he brought in so many speakers to teach us what the job is like. At the end, I decided a different career path because I don't have the incredible emotional strength needed to work with and help abusers. I am forever grateful and horrified by the things I learned in that class, especially the first band stories he told. Instead, I'm going to become a foster parent as soon as I can and do my social work by providing a safe home where no one will be hurt. I will protect and love those children with everything I have. Story 31. I guess I do judge sometimes, but never the patients who have serious problems. I have the hardest time being a good therapist for those with issues like, I am so upset my husband only lets me have 10K a month for shopping, or my kid gets B grades and I'm so upset, or I feel so depressed because my favorite TV show is off the air. Lie! I realize that this may actually be the worst thing they've experienced, and everyone who asks for help should get it. But yeah, I judge, and that's not right. So now I work with veterans as well as offenders so that I can feel useful, and I never feel like I'm judging them. I feel like I'm serving my country and preventing horrific crimes. Now that I typed that out, I see I have some personal work to do on myself. Story 32. Therapists of Reddit. Do you go to a therapist? Is there a hierarchy of therapists? Is there one king therapist that must therapy all the subordinate therapists? And if so, who does the king therapist talk to? Story 33 therapist here. I am a registered psychologist. This is an important part of our training. Our ethics, code of conduct, standards of practice, and our own moral compass are all considered and to be reflected on daily. During my oral ethics exam, this is an important question, and you can't answer, I would never judge anyone. I accept every single person. That's a bullshit answer, as no matter what, we are humans too, who have feelings, emotions, responses, and reactions just like anyone else. My answer was that I would struggle to work with someone who willingly and purposely tortures and kills animals for pleasure. I admitted to my panel of 3 that it would be difficult for my one biases to not pass judgment on an animal abuser. This was the right answer, as they expect psychologists to be able to identify certain populations that they may struggle to deliver competent services to. Story 34. Clinical psychologist with over 20 years of experience. Humans make judgments. The only choice is whether you deny this, or how, or even if you consciously express it. That said, it is surprisingly easy to respect anyone who chooses to reveal themselves and seeks change. Story 35. Not a therapist, but my poor mum has only recently sought therapy for the disturbing things she experienced as a child, and the therapist definitely had a holy judge moment. My mum and her family fled to Australia when she was 6 from Ireland in the early 70s. Her mother and father were both in the Ulster Defence Association, UDA, they fought the IRA, in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. My grandmother was a major player and has killed people. My mum was relaying some of this information to her therapist, and she had the audacity to try to minimize the experience by saying they were probably just accountants. And my mum had to say, well, why did we flee to Australia after their involvement in blowing up a bus? And why did we have guns hidden in our teddy bears? The therapist didn't know what to do or say. Story 36. After working with a client for 2 months on his substance use, inpatient treatment, I thought he was making real progress. He had been having some real change talk and discussing his goals for the future. The next session, he told me that the reason he had so many issues in his life was not the meth use, but his mother. I listened and thought maybe something deep was about to be said about his childhood or his relationship. And then he said, if my mom wasn't such a, I would be living in her house right now. I asked why exactly she would not allow him to currently live with her, and he said, she won't let me use meth in the house. I don't understand. That's like telling her she can't take her heart meds. Internally, I was like, wow TF? Meth will kill you, and you are comparing that to your mom's heart meds. You were so far past this yesterday. But what came out of my mouth was, okay, let's explore that a little more. Story 37. Child therapist here. I had a mother report that her child was having bathroom accidents suddenly, and at home only. He's a 9-year-old boy with no history of bathroom accidents or trauma in the past. Training tells us this could be a variety of things, such as abuse, neglect, anxiety, PTSD, etc. Until I spoke with his in-home behavioral specialist, a clinician that helps behavioral mental health issues inside the home to help create healthy family routines to cope. She called me and told me the real story. The boy was becoming very angry and spiteful with his parents for making him go back to school after full COVID quarantine had been lifted. He went into their bathroom, took his mother's robe, took a giant dump on it, and hung it back up. He also peed inside her dresser drawer. I'm not going to lie, my jaw was dropped when I hung up the phone. I then laughed so hard I nearly fell out of my desk chair. Story 38. When an adolescent at the hospital told me calmly how they had physically assaulted and thrown around a little kid that lived in their neighborhood. No remorse, only stopped because they worried they'd get in trouble. Had to keep the poker face and just document the information, but my son was in preschool at the time and that shook me. Story 39. I worked in an inpatient eating disorder treatment center for youth under 24. We had a girl who was on exercises restrictions due to anorexia. During a parent day, we caught her mom encouraging her to work out with her in the visiting room. Mom didn't understand how exercises could be bad for anyone. I currently provide therapy to victims of sexual violence. I can't tell you how many people in the victim survivors family blame the victim survivors. It's heartbreaking. Story 40. When I worked in crisis, I went to visit someone in the ER. Some main points from her story was that her was an RSO. Her mother and her best friend told her that if she was going to stay with him, they were not going to have contact with her. Her mother has custody of her children and wouldn't let her visit if she was with her. She said that after altercations with her. She ended up in the ER feeling suicidal multiple times, usually every 2 weeks or so. While talking, she admitted that all of her problems were due to her boyfriend. She said that she wasn't going to leave him. As a personal rule, I never tell anyone what to do. I outline the choices they have and the consequences of their choices. This was the first time I wanted to shake the out of a person. BPD is the worst mental disorder IMO. Story 41. In working with a young elementary-age student, he would start masturbating when explaining how he wanted to kill his teacher and classmates in gruesome detail. Thankfully, we were able to transfer him to a more appropriate day school setting where he could receive special services. Story 42. As a therapist, I don't judge my patients or clients. There are usually very complex systems and interferences that factor into a person's ability to cope. That being said, I judge the out of physicians and other practitioners who judge the type of clientele I see. There are some care providers who really lack empathic critical thinking skills. Story 43. Not psych, but we see so much in medicine you get pretty used to crazy stories. In training, there was a guy with schizophrenia. I was asked to evaluate. Everyone knew him. He was in and out of the inpatient psych ward pretty frequently. Long story short, he had awful hallucinations. He visualized and probably felt that he was being raped daily by evil angels. He was terribly agoraphobic because every time he looked up, he was worried to see them. Given that constant fear, he still was able to keep a part-time job on occasion, get groceries, and do most normal everyday things. I was just like, holy, this guy does as good if not better than the rest of us. Story 44. My therapist used to work in a prison, and one day they were giving the inmates education. They were being taught how to put a condom on by practicing on wooden penises, and my therapist told me that at the end of the lesson some of the penises went missing. Story 45. I've been a therapist in California for many years. One day I got a patient, don't remember his full name, but I'll just call him Michael. Michael came into me with a predicament. He told me that he was in witness protection for a robbery in Canada. He said he was forced to change his name and move to an entire different country with his family. He was insane, but in a kind of good way. I could tell he was loyal, but I did not know to who. I have since joined a television station, so I do not know what has happened to him, but I hope he's doing well.